Welcome to Saturday Morning Classics. We're starting a new book this week, and I'm excited about this one. It will keep you on the edge of your seat. It's called The Manitou by Graham Masterton. So sit back, grab a cup of coffee, and enjoy the story. Prelude. The phone bleeped. Without looking up, Dr. Hughes set his hand across the desk in search of it. The hand scrabbled through sheafs of paper, bottles of ink, week-old newspapers, and crumpled sandwich packets. It found the telephone and picked it up. Dr. Hughes put it to his ear. He looked peaky-faced and irritated, like a squirrel trying to store away its nuts. "Hughes, this is McAvoy." "Well, I'm sorry, Dr. McAvoy. I'm very busy." "I didn't mean to interrupt you in your work, Dr. Hughes, but I have a patient down here whose condition should interest you." Dr. Hughes sniffed and took off his rimless glasses. "What kind of condition?" he asked. "Listen, Dr. McAvoy, it's very considerate of you to call me, but I have paperwork as high as a mountain up here, and I really can't—" McAvoy wasn't put off. "Well, I really think you'll be interested, Dr. Hughes. You're interested in tumors, aren't you? Well, we've got a tumor down here to end all tumors." "What's so terrific about it?" "It's sited on the back of the neck. The patient is a female Caucasian, 23 years old, no previous record of tumorous growth, either benign or malignant, and it's moving," said Dr. McAvoy. "The tumor is actually moving, like there's something under the skin that's alive." Dr. Hughes was doodling flowers with his ball pen. He frowned for a moment, then said, "X-ray? Results in 20 minutes. Palpitation? Feels like any other tumor, except that it squirms. Have you tried lancing it? Could it just be an infection?" "I'll wait and see the X-ray first of all." Dr. Hughes sucked thoughtfully at the end of his pen, his mind flicking back over all the pages of all the medical books he had ever absorbed, seeking a parallel case, or a precedent, or even something remotely connected to the idea of a moving tumor. Maybe he was tired, but somehow he couldn't seem to slot the idea in anywhere. "Dr. Hughes?" "Yeah, I'm still here. Listen, what time do you have?" 10 after 3. "Okay, Dr. McAvoy, I'll come down." He laid down the telephone and sat back in his chair and rubbed his eyes. It was St. Valentine's Day, and outside in the streets of New York City, the temperature had dropped to 14 degrees, and there was 6 inches of snow on the ground. The sky was metallic and overcast, and the traffic crept about on muffled wheels. From the 18th story of the Sisters of Jerusalem Hospital, the city had a weird and luminous quality that he'd never seen before. It was like being on the moon, thought Dr. Hughes, or the end of the world, or the Ice Age. There was trouble with the heating system, and he had left his overcoat on. He sat there under the puddle of light from his desk lamp, an exhausted young man of 33, with a nose as sharp and pointy as a scalpel, with a scruffy shock of dark brown hair. He looked more like a teenage auto mechanic than a national expert on malignant tumors. His office door swung open, and a plump, white-haired lady with upswept red spectacles came in, bearing a sheaf of paper and a cup of coffee. "Just a little more paperwork, Dr. Hughes, and I thought you'd like something to warm you up." "Thank you, Mary." He opened the new file that she had brought him and sniffed more persistently. "Oh, my God, have you seen this stuff? I'm supposed to be a consultant, not a filing clerk. Listen, take this back and dump it on Dr. Ridgway. He likes paper. He likes it better than flesh and blood." Mary shrugged. "Dr. Ridgway sent it to you." Dr. Hughes stood up. In his overcoat, he looked like Charlie Chaplin in the Gold Rush. He waved the file around in exasperation, and it knocked over his single Valentine's card, which he knew had been sent by his mother. Okay, I'll have a look at it later. I'm going down to see Dr. McAvoy. He has a patient he wants me to look at. Will you be long, Dr. Hughes? Asked Mary. You have a meeting at 4:30. Dr. Hughes stared at her wearily, as though he was wondering who she was. Long? No, I don't think so. Just as long as it takes. He stepped out of his office into the neon-lit corridor. The Sisters of Jerusalem was an expensive private hospital and never smelled of anything as functional as carbolic and chloroform. The corridors were carpeted in thick red plush, and there were fresh-cut flowers at every corner. It was more like the kind of hotel where middle-aged executives take their secretaries for a weekend of strenuous sin. Dr. Hughes called an elevator and sank to the 15th floor. He stared at himself in the elevator mirror, and he considered he was looking more sick than some of his patients. Perhaps he would take a vacation. His mother had always liked Florida, or maybe they could visit his sister in San Diego. He went through 2 sets of swing doors and into Dr. McAvoy's office. Dr. McAvoy was a short, heavy-built man whose white coats were always far too tight under his arms. He looked like a surgical sausage. His face was big and moon-like and speckled, with a snub little Irish nose. He had once played football for the hospital team until he had fractured his kneecap in a violent tackle. Nowadays, he walked with a slightly over-dramatized limp. "Glad you came down," he smiled. "This really is very peculiar, and I know you're the world's greatest expert." "Hardly," said Dr. Hughes, "but thanks for the compliment." Dr. McAvoy stuck his finger in his ear and screwed it around with great thoughtfulness and care. "The x-rays will be here in 5 or 10 minutes. Meanwhile, I can't think what else I can do." "Can you show me the patient?" asked Dr. Hughes. "Of course. She's in my waiting room. I should take your overcoat off if I were you. She might think I brought you in off the street." Dr. Hughes hung up his shapeless black coat and then followed Dr. McAvoy through to the brightly lit waiting room. There were armchairs and magazines and flowers and a fish tank full of bright tropical fish. Through the Venetian blinds, Dr. Hughes could see the odd metallic radiance of the afternoon snow. In a corner of the room, reading a copy of Sunset, was a slim, dark-haired girl. She had a squarish, delicate face, a bit like an imp, thought Dr. Hughes. She was wearing a plain coffee-colored dress that made her cheeks look rather sallow. The only clue to her nervousness was an ashtray crammed with cigarette butts and a haze of smoke in the air. "Miss Tandy," said Dr. McAvoy, "this is Dr. Hughes. Dr. Hughes is an expert on conditions of your kind, and he would just like to take a look at you and ask you a few questions." Miss Tandy laid aside her magazine and smiled. "Sure," she said, in a distinctive New England accent. Good family, thought Dr. Hughes. He didn't have to guess if she was wealthy or not. You just didn't seek treatment at the Sisters of Jerusalem Hospital unless you had more cash than you could raise off the floor. "Lean forward," said Dr. Hughes. Miss Tandy bent over, and Dr. Hughes lifted the hair at the back of her neck. Right in the hollow of her neck was a smooth, round bulge, about the size and shape of a glass paperweight. Dr. Hughes ran his fingers over it, and it seemed to have the normal texture of a benign, fibrous growth. "How long have you had this?" he asked. 2 or 3 days, said Miss Tandy. "I made an appointment as soon as it started to grow. I was frightened it was, cancer or something." Dr. Hughes looked across at Dr. McAvoy and frowned. 2 or 3 days? Are you sure?" "Exactly," said Miss Tandy. "Today is Friday, isn't it? Well, I first felt it when I woke up on Tuesday morning." Dr. Hughes squeezed the tumor gently in his hand. It was firm and hard, but he couldn't detect any movement. "Does that hurt?" he asked. "There's a kind of a prickling sensation, but that's about all." Dr. McAvoy said, "She felt the same thing when I squeezed it." Dr. Hughes let Miss Tandy's hair fall back and told her she could sit up straight again. He pulled up an armchair and found a tatty scrap of paper in his pocket and started to jot down a few notes as he talked to her. "How big was the tumor when you first noticed it?" "Very small, about the size of a butter bean, I guess." "Did it grow all the time or only at special times?" "It only seems to grow at night. I mean, every morning I wake up and it's bigger." Dr. Hughes made a detailed squiggle on his piece of paper. "Can you feel it normally? I mean, can you feel it now?" "It doesn't seem to be any worse than any other kind of bump, but sometimes I get the feeling that it's shifting." The girl's eyes were dark, and there was more fear in them than her voice was giving away. "Well," she said slowly, "it's almost like somebody trying to get comfortable in bed, sort of shifting around and then lying still." "How often does this happen?" She looked worried. She could sense the bafflement in Dr. Hughes, and that worried her. "I don't know, maybe 4 or 5 times a day?" Dr. Hughes made some more notes and chewed his lip. "Miss Tandy, have you noticed any changes in your own personal condition of health over the past few days since you've had this tumor?" "Only a little tiredness. I guess I don't sleep too well at night, but I haven't lost any weight or anything like that." Dr. Hughes wrote some more and looked for a while at what he'd written. "How much do you smoke?" "Usually only a half a pack a day. I'm not a great smoker. I'm just nervous right now, I guess." Dr. McAvoy said, "She had a chest x-ray not long ago. She had a clean bill of health." Dr. Hughes said, "Miss Tandy, do you live alone? Where do you live?" "I'm staying with my aunt on 82nd Street. I'm working for a record company as a personal assistant. I wanted to find an apartment of my own, but my parents thought it would be a good idea if I lived with my aunt for a while. She's 62. She's a wonderful old lady. We get along together just fine." Dr. Hughes lowered his head. "Don't get me wrong when I ask this, Miss Tandy, but I think you'll understand why I have to. Is your aunt in a good state of health, and is the apartment clean? There's no health risk there, like cockroaches or blocked drains or food dirt?" Miss Tandy almost grinned, for the first time since Dr. Hughes had seen her. "My aunt is a wealthy woman, Dr. Hughes. She has a full-time house cleaner and a maid to help with the cooking and entertaining." Dr. Hughes nodded. "Okay, we'll leave it like that for now. Let's go and chase up those x-rays, Dr. McAvoy." They went back into Dr. McAvoy's office and sat down. Dr. McAvoy took out a stick of chewing gum and bent it between his teeth. "What do you make of it, Dr. Hughes?" Dr. Hughes sighed. "At the moment, I don't make anything at all. This bump came up in 2 or 3 days, and I've never come across a tumor that did that before. Then there's this sensation of movement. Have you felt it move yourself?" "Sure," said Dr. McAvoy. "Just a slight shifting, like there was something under there. That may be caused by movements of the neck, but we can't really tell until we see the x-rays." They sat in silence for a few minutes, with the noises of the hospital leaking faintly from the building all around them. Dr. Hughes felt cold and weary and wondered when he was going to get home. He had been up until 2 a.m. last night, dealing with files and statistics, and it looked as though he was going to be just as late tonight. He sniffed and stared at his scruffy brown shoe on the carpet. After 5 or 6 minutes, the office door opened, and the radiologist came in with a large brown envelope. She was a tall woman with short-cut hair and no sense of humor at all. "What do you make of them, Selina?" asked Dr. McAvoy, taking the envelope across the room to his light box. "I'm not sure at all, Dr. McAvoy. It's clear enough, but it doesn't make any kind of sense." Dr. McAvoy took out the black x-ray film and clipped it up. He switched on the light, and they had a view of the back of Miss Tandy's skull. From the side, there was the tumor, all right, a large, shadowy lump, but inside it, instead of the normal fibrous growth, there seemed to be a small, tangled knot of tissue and bone. "See here," said Dr. McAvoy, pointing with his ballpoint. "There seems to be roots of some kind, bony roots, holding the inside of the tumor against the neck. Now, what the hell do you think that is?" "I haven't the slightest idea," said Dr. Hughes. "I've never seen anything remotely like this before. It doesn't seem like a tumor at all." Dr. McAvoy shrugged. "Okay, it's not a tumor. So what is it?" Dr. Hughes peered closely at the X-ray. The little knot of tissue and bone was too formless and mixed up to make any sense out of it. There was only one thing to do, and that was to operate. Cut it out and examine it in the open. And at the rate it was growing, that operation had better be done quickly. Dr. Hughes picked up the telephone on Dr. McAvoy's desk. "Mary, listen, I'm still down here with Dr. McAvoy. Would you see how soon Dr. Snaith has a space available for surgery? I have something here that needs urgent attention. That's right, yes, a tumor, but it's very malignant, and there might be problems if we don't operate fast. That's it. Thanks." "Malignant?" said Dr. McAvoy. "How do we know it's malignant?" Dr. Hughes shook his head. "We don't know, but until we find out whether it's dangerous or harmless, I'm going to treat it as dangerous." "I just wish I knew what the hell it was," said Dr. McAvoy gloomily. "I've been right through the medical dictionary, and there just isn't anything like it." Dr. Hughes grinned tiredly. "Maybe it's a new disease. Maybe they'll name it after you. McAvoy's malady. Fame at last. You always wanted to be famous, didn't you?" "Right now I'd settle for a cup of coffee and a hot beef sandwich. The Nobel Prize I can have any time." The phone bleeped. Dr. Hughes picked it up. "Mary? Oh, right, okay, that's fine. Yes, that'll do. Tell Dr. Snaith thank you." "He's free?" asked Dr. McAvoy. "Tomorrow morning, 10 a.m. I better go and tell Miss Tandy." Dr. Hughes pushed through the double doors into the waiting room, and Miss Tandy was still sitting there, halfway through another cigarette, and staring, without seeing, at the open magazine on her lap. "Miss Tandy?" She looked up quickly. "Oh, yes?" she said. Dr. Hughes drew up a chair and sat down next to her with his hands clasped in front of him. He tried to look serious and steady and reliable, to calm her obvious fright, but he was so tired that he didn't succeed in looking anything but morbid. "Listen, Miss Tandy, I think we'll have to operate. It doesn't look as though this swelling is anything to worry about, but at the rate it's been growing, I'd like to see it removed as soon as possible, and I guess you would too." She raised her hand toward the back of her neck, then dropped it and nodded. "I understand, of course." "If you can be here by 8 o'clock tomorrow morning, we'll have Dr. Snaith remove it for you around 10. Dr. Snaith is a very fine surgeon, and he has years of experience with tumors like yours." Miss Tandy attempted to smile. "That's very kind of you. Thank you." Dr. Hughes shrugged. "Don't thank me. I'm only doing my job. But listen, I don't think you have anything to worry about. I won't pretend that your condition is not unusual, because it is. But part of our profession is dealing with unusual conditions. You've come to the right place." Miss Tandy stubbed out her cigarette and gathered her things together. "Will I need anything special?" she asked. "A couple of night dresses, I suppose, and a wrap?" Dr. Hughes nodded. "Bring some slippers, too. You're not going to be exactly bedridden." "Okay," she said, and Dr. Hughes showed her out. He watched her walk quickly down the corridor to the elevator, and he thought how slim and young and elf-like she looked. He wasn't one of those specialists who thought of his patients in terms of their condition and nothing else, not like Dr. Pawson, the lung specialist, who could remember individual ailments long after he'd forgotten the faces that went with them. Life is more an endless parade of lumps and bumps, thought Dr. Hughes. At least, I hope it is. He was still standing in the corridor when Dr. McAvoy poked his moon-like face round the door. "Dr. Hughes?" "Yes?" "Come inside a moment. Take a look at this." He followed Dr. McAvoy tiredly into his office. While he had been talking to Miss Tandy, Dr. McAvoy had been looking through his medical reference books, and there were diagrams and x-rays strewn all around his desk. "You found something?" asked Dr. Hughes. "I don't know. It seems to be as ridiculous as anything else in this case." Dr. McAvoy handed him a heavy textbook, opened at a page covered with charts and diagrams. Dr. Hughes frowned and examined them carefully, and then he went over to the light box and peered at the pictures of Miss Tandy's skull again. "That's crazy," he said. Dr. McAvoy stood there with his hands on his hips and nodded. "You're quite right, it's crazy, but you have to admit it looks pretty much like it." Dr. Hughes shut the book. "But even if you're right, in 2 days? Well, if this is possible, anything is possible." "Well, if this is possible, the Red Sox will win the next series." The two pale doctors stood in their office on the 15th floor of the hospital and looked at the x-rays and just didn't know what to say next. "Perhaps it's a hoax?" said Dr. McAvoy. Dr. Hughes shook his head. "No way. How could it be? And what for?" "I don't know. People dream up hoaxes for all kinds of reasons." "Can you think of a reason for this?" Dr. McAvoy grimaced. "Can you believe it's real?" "I don't know," replied Dr. Hughes. "Maybe it is. Maybe it's the one case in a million that's really real." They opened the book again and studied the x-ray again, and the more they compared the diagrams with Miss Tandy's tumor, the more resemblance they discovered. According to clinical gynecology, the knot of tissue and bone that Miss Tandy was harboring in the back of her neck was a human fetus, of a size that suggested it was about 8 weeks old. Chapter 1. Out of the Night. If you think it's an easy life being a mystic, you ought to try telling 15 fortunes a day at $25 a time, and then see whether you're quite so keen on it. At the same moment that Karen Tandy was consulting Dr. Hughes and Dr. McAvoy at the Sisters of Jerusalem Hospital, I was giving old Mrs. Winconis a quick tour of her immediate prospects with the help of the tarot cards. We were sitting around the green table in my 10th Avenue flat, with the drapes drawn tight and the incense smoldering suggestively in the corner, and my genuine simulated antique oil lamp casting pretty mysterious shadows. Mrs. Winconis was wrinkled and old and smelled of musty perfume and fox fur coats, and she came around every Friday evening for a detailed rundown of the 7 days ahead. As I laid out the cards in the Celtic cross, she fidgeted and sniffed and peered across at me like I was a moth-eaten ermine scenting its prey. I knew she was dying to ask me what I saw, but I never gave any hints until the whole thing was set out on the table. The more suspense, the better. I had to go through the whole performance of frowning and sighing and biting my lips and making out that I was in communication with the powers from beyond. After all, that's what she paid her $25 for. But she couldn't resist the temptation. As the last card went down, she leaned forward and asked, "What is it, Mr. Erskine? What do you see? Is there anything about Daddy?" Daddy was her name for Mr. Winconis, a fat and dour old supermarket manager who chain-smoked cigars and didn't believe in anything more mystical than the first 3 runners at Aqueduct. Mrs. Winconis never suggested as much, but it was plain from the way she talked that her greatest hope in life was for Daddy's heart to give out and the Winconis fortune to come her way. I looked at the cards with my usual elaborate concentration. I knew as much about the tarot as anybody did who had taken the trouble to read Tarot Made Easy, but it was the style that carried it off. If you want to be a mystic, which is actually easier than being an advertising copywriter, or a summer camp warden, or a coach tour guide, then you have to look like a mystic. Since I am a rather mousy 32-year-old from Cleveland, Ohio, with the beginnings of a bald patch underneath my scrubby brown hair, and a fine but overlarge nose in my fine but pallid face, I took the trouble to paint my eyebrows into a satanic arch, and wear an emerald satin cloak with moons and stars sewn on it, and perch a triangle green hat on my head. The hat used to have a badge on it that said Green Bay Packers, but I took it off for obvious reasons. I invested in incense and a few leather-bound copies of the Encyclopedia Britannica and a beaten-up old skull from a second-hand store in the village, and then I placed an advertisement in the newspapers which read, "The Incredible Erskine, Fortunes Read, Future Foretold, Your Fate Revealed." Within a couple of months I was handling more business than I knew what to do with, and for the first time in my life I was able to afford a new Mercury Cougar and a quad stereo with earphones to match. But, as I say, it wasn't easy. The constant tide of middle-aged ladies who came simpering into my apartment, dying to hear what was going to happen in their tedious middle-aged lives, was almost enough to drown me forever in the well of human despair. "Well," said Mrs. Winconis, clutching her alligator pocketbook in her wrinkled old fingers, "what can you see, Mr. Erskine?" I shook my head slowly and magnificently. "The cards are solemn today, Mrs. Winconis. They carry many warnings. They tell you that you are pressing too hard toward a future that, when it comes to pass, you may not enjoy as much as you thought. I see a portly gentleman with a cigar. It must be Daddy. He is saying something in great sorrow. He is saying something about money." "What is he saying? Do the cards tell you what he is saying?" whispered Mrs. Winconis. Whenever I mentioned money, she started to twitch and jump like a spit on a red-hot stove. I've seen some pretty ugly lusts in my time, but the lust for money in middle-aged women is enough to make you lose your lunch. "He is saying that something is too expensive," I went on in my special hollow voice. "Something is definitely too expensive. I know what it is. I can see what it is. He is saying that canned salmon is too expensive. He doesn't think that people will want to buy it at that price." "Oh," said Mrs. Winconis, vexed. But I knew what I was doing. I had checked the price rise column in the supermarket report that morning, and I knew that canned salmon was due for an increase. Next week, when Daddy started complaining about it, Mrs. Winconis would remember my words and be mightily impressed with my incredible clairvoyant talents. "What about me?" asked Mrs. Winconis. "What is going to happen to me?" I stared gloomily at the cards. "Not a good week, I'm afraid. Not a good week at all. On Monday you will have an accident. Not a serious one. Nothing worse than dropping a heavy weight on your foot. But it will be painful. It will keep you awake Monday night. On Tuesday you will play bridge with your friends as usual. Someone will cheat you, but you will not discover who it is, so keep your stakes small and don't take any risks. Wednesday you will have an unpleasant telephone call, possibly obscene. Thursday you will eat a meal that does not agree with you, and you will wish that you never ate it." Mrs. Winconis fixed me with her dull gray eyes. "Is it really that bad?" she asked. "It doesn't have to be. Remember that the cards can warn as well as foretell. If you take steps to avoid these pitfalls, you will not necessarily have such a bad week." "Oh, well, thank God for that," she said. "It's worth the money just to know what to look out for." "The spirits think well of you, Mrs. Winconus," I said in my special voice. "They care for you, and would not like to see you discomfited or harmed. If you treat the spirits right, they will treat you right." She stood up. "Mr. Erskine, I don't know how to thank you. I'd best be getting along now. But I'll see you next week, won't I?" I smiled my secret smile. "Of course, Mrs. Winconus, and don't forget your mystic motto for the week." "Oh, no, of course not. What is it this week, Mr. Erskine?" I opened a tattered old book that I kept on the table next to me. "Your mystic motto for this week is, 'Guard well the pips, and the fruit shall grow without let.'" She stood there for a moment with a faraway smile on her withered old face. "That's beautiful, Mr. Erskine. I shall repeat it every morning when I wake up. Thank you for a wonderful, wonderful session." "The pleasure," I said, "is all mine." I showed her to the elevator, taking care that none of my neighbors saw me in my ridiculous green cloak and hat, and waved her a fond farewell. As soon as she had sunk out of sight, I went back into my flat, switched on the light, blew out the incense, and turned on the television. Without any luck, I wouldn't have missed too much of Kojak. I was just going to the icebox to fetch myself a can of beer when the telephone rang. I tucked the receiver under my chin and opened up the beer as I talked. The voice on the other end was female, of course, and nervous, of course. Only nervous females sought the services of a man like the incredible Erskine. "Mr. Erskine?" Erskine's the name, fortune-telling's the game. "Mr. Erskine, I wonder if I could come round and see you." Of course, of course. The fee is $25 for your ordinary glimpse into the immediate future, $35 for a year's forecast, $50 for a lifetime review." "I just want to know what's going to happen tomorrow." The voice sounded young and very worried. I took a quick mental guess at a pregnant and abandoned secretary. "Well, madam, that's my line. What time do you want to come?" "Around 9? Is that too late?" 9 is fine, and the pleasure's mine. Can I have your name, please?" "Tandy. Karen Tandy. Thank you, Mr. Erskine. I'll see you at 9. It might seem strange to you that an intelligent girl like Karen Tandy should seek help from a terrible quack like me, but until you've been dabbling in clairvoyance for quite a while, you don't realize how vulnerable people feel when they're threatened by things they don't understand. This is particularly true of illness and death, and most of my clients have some kind of question about their own mortality to ask. No matter how reassuring and competent a surgeon may be, he can't give people any answers when it comes to what is going to happen if their lives are suddenly snuffed out. It's no good a doctor saying, "Well, see here, madam, if your brain ceases to give out any more electronic impulses, we'll have to consider that you are lost and gone forever." Death is too frightening, too total, too mystical for people to want to believe it has anything to do with the facts of medicine and surgery. They want to believe in a life after death, or at the very least in a spirit world where the mournful ghosts of their long-dead ancestors roam about in the celestial equivalent to silk pajamas. I could see the fear of death on Karen Tandy's face when she knocked at my door. In fact, it was so strongly marked that I felt less than comfortable in my green cloak and my funny little green hat. She was delicately boned and pointy-faced, the sort of girl who always won races in high school athletics, and she spoke with a grave politeness that made me feel more fraudulent than ever. "Are you Mr. Erskine?" she asked. "That's me. Fortune's read, future's foretold. You know the rest." She walked quietly into my room and looked around at the incense burner and the yellowed skull and the close-drawn drapes. I suddenly felt that the whole setup was incredibly phony and false, but she didn't seem to notice. I drew out a chair for her to sit on and offered her a cigarette. When I lit it, I could see that her hands were trembling. "All right, Miss Tandy," I asked her. "What's the problem?" "I don't know how to explain it, really. I've been to the hospital already, and they're going to give me an operation tomorrow morning, but there are all kinds of things I couldn't tell them about." I sat back and smiled encouragingly. "Why don't you try telling me?" "It's very difficult," she said in her soft, light voice. "I get the feeling that it's something much more than it seems." "Well," I said, crossing my legs under my green silk robe, "would you like to tell me what it is?" She raised her hand shyly to the back of her neck. "About 3 days ago, Tuesday morning I think it was, I began to feel a kind of irritation there, at the back of my neck. It swelled up, and I was worried in case it was something serious, and I went to the hospital to have it looked at." "I see," I said sympathetically. Sympathy, as you can probably guess, accounts for 98% of anyone's success as a clairvoyant. "And what did the doctors tell you?" "They said it was nothing to worry about, but at the same time they seemed pretty anxious to take it off." I smiled. "So where do I come in?" "Well, my aunt's been to see you once or twice, Mrs. Carmen. I live with her. She doesn't know I'm here, but she's always said how good you are, and so I thought I could try you myself." Well, it was nice to know that my occult services were being praised abroad. Mrs. Carmen was a lovely old lady who believed that her dead husband was always trying to get in touch with her from the spirit world. She came to see me 2 or 3 times a month, whenever the dear departed Mr. Carmen sent her a message from beyond. It happened in her dreams, she always told me. She heard him whispering in a strange language in the middle of the night, and that was the signal for her to trot over to 10th Avenue and spend a few dollars with me. Very good business, Mrs. Carmen. "You want me to read your cards?" I asked, raising one of my devilishly arched eyebrows. Karen Tandy shook her head. She looked more serious and worried than almost any client I could remember. I hoped she wasn't going to ask me to do something that required real occult talent. "It's the dreams, Mr. Erskine. Ever since this bump has started growing, I've had terrible dreams. The first night, I thought it was just an ordinary nightmare, but I've had the same dream every night, and each night it's been clear. I don't even know if I want to go to bed tonight because I just know I'm going to have the same dream, and it's going to be even more vivid and very much worse." I pulled thoughtfully at the end of my nose. It was a habit of mine whenever I was pondering something over, and probably accounted for the size of my schnock. Some people scratch their heads when they think and get dandruff. I just tug at my hooter. "Miss Tandy, a lot of people have reoccurring dreams. It usually means that they're worrying about the same thing over and over. I don't think it's anything to get hot up about." She stared at me with these big, deep, chocolate brown eyes. "It's not that kind of dream, Mr. Erskine, I'm sure. It's too real. With the ordinary sort of dream, you feel like it's all happening inside your head. But with this one, it seems to be happening all around me, outside me, as well as inside my brain." "Well," I said, "supposing you tell me what it is." "It always starts the same way. I dream I'm standing on a strange island. It's winter, and there's a very cold wind blowing. I can feel that wind, even though the windows are always closed in my bedroom. It's nighttime, and the moon is up there behind the clouds. In the distance, beyond the woods, I can see a river, or perhaps it's the sea. It's shining in the moonlight. I look around me, and there seem to be rows of dark huts. It looks like a kind of village, a sort of primitive village. In fact, I know it's a village, but there doesn't seem to be anyone around. Then I'm walking across the grass towards the river. I know my way because I feel I've been living on this strange island all my life. I feel that I am frightened, but at the same time I feel I have some hidden powers of my own, and that I am probably capable of overcoming my fear. I am frightened of the unknown, things that I don't understand. I reach the river and I stand on the beach. It is still very cold. I look across the water and I can see a dark sailing ship anchored offshore. There is nothing in my dream which suggests that it's anything else but an ordinary sailing ship, but at the same time I am very frightened by it. It seems strange and unfamiliar, almost as though it's a flying saucer from another world. I stand on the beach for a long time, and then I see a small boat leave the sailing ship and start rowing toward the shore. I cannot see who is in the boat. I start running across the grass, back to the village, and then I go into one of the huts. The hut seems familiar. I know I've been there before. In fact, I can almost believe that it's my hut. There is an odd smell in it, like herbs or incense or something. I have a desperately urgent feeling that there is something I must do. I don't quite know what it is, but I must do it, whatever it is. It is something to do with the frightening people in the boat, something to do with this dark sailing ship. The fear seems to grow and grow inside me until I can hardly think. Something is going to come out of the ship, which will have a terrible effect. There is something in that ship that is alien, something powerful and magical, and I am desperate about it. Then I wake up. Miss Tandy was screwing a handkerchief around and around in her fingers. Her voice was soft and light, but it carried a prickly kind of conviction that made me distinctly uneasy. I watched her as she spoke, and she seemed to believe that whatever she had dreamed about was something that had actually happened to her. I took off my Green Bay Packers hat. It was a little incongruous under the circumstances. Miss Tandy, that is a very odd dream. It is always the same, in every detail? Exactly. It's always the same. There is always this fear of what is coming out of that ship. And you say it's a sailing ship? Like a yacht? Something like that? She shook her head. It's not a yacht. It's more like a galleon. One of those old-time galleons. 3 masts and lots of rigging. I pulled my nose some more and thought hard. Is there anything about this ship which gives you a clue to what it is? Is there a name on it? It's too far away. It's too dark. Does it fly any flags? There is a flag, but I couldn't describe it. I stood up and went over to my bookcase of occult paperbacks. I pulled out 10,000 Dreams Interpreted and a couple of others. I laid them out on the green table and looked up 1 or 2 references about islands and ships. They weren't helpful. Occult textbooks are almost invariably unhelpful, and often they're downright confusing, but that doesn't stop me from drawing a few dark and mysterious conclusions about my clients' nocturnal flights of fancy. Ships are usually connected with some kind of travel or the arrival of news. In your case, the ship is dark and frightening, which suggests to me that the news may not be good news. The island represents your feelings of isolation and fear. In fact, the island represents yourself. Whatever this news may be, it is a direct threat to you as a person. Karen Tandy nodded. I don't know why, but I felt really guilty handing her out all this bullshit. There was something genuinely defenseless and tense about her, and there she was with her dark brown bobbed hair and her pale impish face, so serious and lost, and I began to wonder if her dreams were really real. Miss Tandy, I said. May I call you Karen? Of course. I'm Harry. My grandmother calls me Henry, but no one else does. It's a nice name. Thank you. Look, listen, Karen, I'm going to be frank with you. I don't know why, but there's something about your case that doesn't strike the same kind of bells as the usual stuff I get. Old ladies trying to get in touch with their Pekingese dogs in the happy kennels in the sky. That kind of garbage. There's something about your dream that's, I don't know, authentic. This didn't reassure her at all. The last thing that people want to be told is that their fears are actually well-founded. Even intelligent, educated people like to be comforted with the thought that their nighttime visitations are all a cozy kind of bunk. I mean, if half the nightmares that people had were actually real, they'd go straight off their heads. Part of my job was soothing over my clients' terror and telling them that the things they dream about were never going to happen. What do you mean, authentic? I handed her another cigarette. This time, when she lit it, her hands weren't quite so trembly. It's like this, Karen. Some people, even though they're not aware of it, have the potential power to be mediums. In other words, they're very receptive to all the occult buzz-fuzz that's flying about in the atmosphere. A medium is like a radio or a television set. Because of the way he or she is made, she's capable of picking up signals that other people can't, and she can interpret them into sound or pictures. What signals? She frowned. I don't understand. There are all kinds of signals, I said. You can't see a television signal, can you? Yet it's around you all the time. This whole room is crowded with images and ghosts, pictures of David Brinkley and advertisements for Kellogg's cornflakes. All you have to do to pick them up is have the right kind of receiver. Karen Tandy puffed smoke. You mean that my dream is a signal? But what kind of a signal? And where could it come from? And why does it pick on me? I shook my head. I don't know why it's picked on you, and I don't know where it's from. It could have come from anywhere. There are authenticated reports of people in America having dreams that have given them detailed information about people in other countries far away. There was a farmer in Iowa who dreamed that he was drowning in a flood in Pakistan, and the same night there was a monsoon rain in Pakistan that killed 400 people. The only way you can account for stuff like this is by thinking of thought waves as signals. The farmer picked up the signal through his subconscious mind from a Pakistani guy who was drowning. It's weird, I know, but it has happened. Karen Tandy looked at me appealingly. So, how can I ever find out what my dream is really all about? Supposing it's a signal from someone, somewhere in the world, who needs help, and I can't find out who it is. Well, if you're really interested in finding out, there's one way to do it, I told her. Please, just tell me what to do. I really do want to know. I mean, I'm sure it's something to do with this tumor thing, and I want to know what it is. I nodded. Okay, Karen, then this is what you do. Tonight, I want you to go to sleep as usual, and if you have the same dream over again, I want you to try and remember as many details, factual details, as you can. Look around the island and see if you can spot any landmarks. When you go down to the river, try and map out as much of the coastline as you can. If there's a bay or something, try and remember the shape of it. If there's anything across the river, any mountain or harbor or anything like that, fix it in your mind. Now, there's one other thing that's very important. Try and get a look at the flag on the sailing ship. Memorize it. Then, the moment you wake up, note everything down in as much detail as you can and make as many pictorial sketches as you can of everything you've seen. Then bring it to me. She stubbed out her cigarette. I have to be at the hospital by 8 tomorrow morning. Which hospital? Sisters of Jerusalem. Well, look, because it's obviously important, I'll drop by the hospital and you can leave the notes for me in an envelope. How's that? Mr. Erskine, Harry, that's terrific. At last I really feel like I'm getting down to something. I came over and took her hand in mine. She was cute, in her pixie kind of way, And if I hadn't been utterly professional and detached from my clients, and if she hadn't been going into hospital the next day, I think I would definitely have taken her for dinner, a friendly ride in my cougar, and back to Erskine's occult emporium for a night of earthly activity. "How much do I owe you?" she said, breaking the spell. "Pay me next week," I replied. It's always boosted the morale of people who are going into hospital if you ask them to pay you after their operation. It suddenly made them think that perhaps they were going to live after all. "Okay, Harry, thank you," she said softly and stood up to leave. "You don't mind finding your own way out, do you?" I asked. I flapped my green gown around by way of explanation. "The neighbors, you know." Karen Tandy smiled and said good night. I wondered how good it was really going to be. After she'd left, I sat down in my armchair and had a long think. There was something wrong with all this. Usually when my clients came fluttering in to tell me their dreams, they were standard Technicolor epics of frustrated sex and erotic embarrassment, like going to a cocktail party with the Vanderbilts and forgetting to get dressed first. There were dreams of flying and dreams of eating and dreams of accidents and nameless fears, but none of the dreams had ever had the uncanny photographic clarity and the same totally logical sequence as the dream of Karen Tandy. I picked up the telephone and dialed. It rang for a couple of minutes before it was answered. "Hello?" said an elderly voice. "Who is this?" "Mrs. Carmen, this is Harry Erskine. I'm sorry to trouble you so late." "Why, Mr. Erskine, how nice to hear your voice. I was in the tub, you know, but I'm all snuggled up in my bath towel now." "Oh, I'm sorry, Mrs. Carmen. Do you mind if I ask you a question?" The old dear giggled. "As long as it's not too personal, Mr. Erskine." "I'm afraid not, Mrs. Carmen. Listen, Mrs. Carmen, do you recall a dream you told me about 2 or 3 months ago?" "Which one was it, Mr. Erskine? The one about my husband?" "That's right, the one about your husband asking you for help." "Well, now, let me see," said Mrs. Carmen. "If I remember it rightly, I was standing by the seaside, and it was the middle of the night, and it was awfully cold. I remember thinking I ought to have put my wrap on before I'd come out. Then I heard my husband whispering to me. He always whispers, you know. He never comes out loud and shouts in my ear. He was whispering something I didn't understand at all, but I was sure he was asking for help." I felt distinctly strange and worried. I don't mind messing around with the occult when it behaves itself, but when it starts acting up, then I start getting a little bit of the creeps. "Mrs. Carmen," I said, "do you recall seeing anything else in your dream, apart from a seashore? Was there a ship or a boat out there? Did you see any huts or a village?" "I can't recall there was anything else," replied Mrs. Carmen. "Is there any particular reason you want to know?" "It's just some article I'm writing on dreams for a magazine, Mrs. Carmen. Nothing important. I just thought I'd like to include 1 or 2 of your dreams, since they've always been very interesting." I could almost see the old lady fluttering her eyelashes. "Why, Mr. Erskine, that's awfully nice of you to say so." "Oh, one more thing, Mrs. Carmen, and this is important." "Yes, Mr. Erskine?" "Don't tell anyone else about this conversation. Nobody else at all. Do you understand me?" She let out a breath, as though the last thing in the whole world that would ever occur to her would be to gossip. "Not a whisper, Mr. Erskine, I swear." "Thank you, Mrs. Carmen. You've been a terrific help," I said, and I laid down the phone more slowly and carefully than I've ever done in my life. Was it possible for 2 people to have identical dreams? If it was, then maybe all this bunk about signals from beyond could be real. Maybe both Karen Tandy and her aunt, Mrs. Carmen, was capable of picking up a message from out there, from out of the night, and playing it through in their minds. I didn't take any notice of the fact that Mrs. Carman claimed it was her husband trying to get in touch with her. All elderly widows thought their husbands were floating around in the ether, anxiously trying to tell them something of vital importance, whereas what their phantom partners were probably doing out there in spirit land was playing golf and enjoying a few years of peace and quiet before their erstwhile wives came up to join them. What I thought was that the same person was trying to get in touch with both of them, trying to communicate some nameless fear that had gripped her, and I guessed it was probably a woman, but you couldn't really tell with spirits. I was sitting in my flat thinking all these irreverent thoughts when I had the oddest sensation that someone was standing behind me, just out of my line of vision. I didn't want to turn around, because that would have been an admission of ridiculous fear, but all the same there was an itching feeling in the middle of my back, and I couldn't help casting my eyes sideways to see if there were any unaccustomed shadows on the wall. Eventually I stood up and threw a rapid glance backwards. Of course there was nothing there, but I couldn't help thinking that something or somebody had been. Somebody dark and silent. I whistled rather loudly and went to pour myself 3 or 4 fingers of scotch. If there was one kind of spirit of which I thoroughly approved, it was this. The sharp bite of malt and barley brought me down to earth in a very rapid order. I decided to cast the tarot cards to see what they had to say about all this. Now, out of all the mumbo-jumbo of clairvoyance and spiritualism, I have a certain respect for the tarot. In spite of myself, I don't want to believe in it, but it has a peculiar knack of telling you exactly what kind of state you're in, no matter how hard you're trying to hide it. And each card has an odd feeling about it, as though it's a momentary picture from a dream you can never quite recall. I shuffled the cards and laid them out on the green table. I used the Celtic cross arrangement of 10 cards because it's the easiest. This crosses you, this crowns you, this is beneath you, and this is behind you. I asked the tarot one simple question, and I obeyed all the rules and kept it firmly in front of my mind. The question was, who is talking to Karen Tandy from beyond? As I laid out the cards one by one, I couldn't help frowning. I had never had such a peculiar reading in my life. Some tarot cards hardly ever come up, and when they do, they strike you straight away because they're so unfamiliar. Most people's readings are full of minor litigation cards, or cards that show anxiety about money, or arguments in the home, all the lesser cards in the suits of cups and wands and pentacles. You very seldom see cards of terrible disasters, like the Tower, which shows tiny people hurled out of a castle by a jagged flash of lightning, and I had never once turned up Death. But Death came up in his black armor, on his red-eyed black horse, with bishops and children bowing in front of him, and so did the Devil, with his hostile hairy glare, his ram's horns, and naked people chained to his throne. And so did the magician, reversed. This way round, the magician's card signified a physician or magus, mental disease and disquiet. I sat staring at the cards for almost half an hour. The magician? What the hell did that mean? Did it mean that Karen Tandy was mentally disordered? Maybe it did. Perhaps that tumor on the neck had affected her brain. The trouble with these damned cards was that they were never specific enough. They gave you 4 or 5 varying interpretations, and you had to make your own mind up. The magician? I shuffled the cards again and used the magician card as my question. To do that, I had to place it in the center of the table, cover it over with another card, and lay out the Celtic cross all over again. The cards would then give me a more detailed explanation of what the magician was all about. 9 cards went down, and then I turned up the 10th. I had a very weird sensation in the bottom of my stomach, and I started to feel that someone was watching me again. This couldn't be possible. The 10th card was the magician, too. I lifted the card that covered my question card, and under there was death. Perhaps I'd made a mistake. All the same, I was pretty sure I'd laid the magician down first. I took up all the cards again and placed the magician firmly down there on the table and covered it over with the 2 of wands, and went on putting down cards until I came to the last one. There was nothing on it at all. It was blank. Now, I didn't believe in all this fortune-telling stuff, but I definitely got the feeling that someone out there was telling me loudly and firmly to mind my own business. I looked at my watch. It was midnight, a good time for ghosts and spirits and a good time to be getting to bed. Tomorrow I was definitely going to take a look at what Karen Tandy had scribbled down in her envelope.